Well, thank you so much, Clark, and thank you everyone for coming this morning to hear our discussion about DMVMoves. I'm really honored to be here today with Jack McDougle and Bryan Hill, who co-chaired the advisory groups that help support the DMVMoves task force. As Clark said, the DMVMoves initiative was kind of a joint initiative put forward by the WMATA board and the COG board, and ultimately kind of the big body there was this task force. And we spent a lot of time working with these advisory groups, asking very detailed questions of WMATA, but also getting direction from that task force. And so before we get into some of the discussion here, I want to talk about some of the direction we received that really influenced the final product that the general manager talked about earlier. So, when you talk about transit in this region, you can go in a million different directions, right? You could talk about state of good repair. You could talk about maximizing or modernizing the system. You could talk about expansions. The task force throughout this process was very clear to me, and in turn these co-chairs, that what they wanted us focusing on was ensuring the state of good repair of the system and maximizing what it delivered for this region. They told us until that was done, they didn't want to have a lot of discussion about expansion. We needed to get the house in order and get as much out of that house as we could, and after that, we could start to have discussions potentially about expansion, but in terms of where we were for DMVMoves, that was not something that we were trying to solve for. And so it's not going to be a part of what was presented by the general manager or what we're going to be talking about here today. One of the other things that we talked about with the task force is how did we want to solve the funding need, whatever it might be, as we worked through this process? Did we want to, as a region, come together and do a single regional revenue source that would fund WMATA, or did we want to follow more of the 2018 model or the past model where each jurisdiction, and by that I mean Virginia, Maryland, and DC, comes up with its own way of funding what those needs would be? And we talked about that for a while, and there's pros and cons depending on what your perspective is. And the task force was very clear that each jurisdiction should solve this problem in its own way, just like they did in 2018, in whatever way best meets their needs. And so today we're not going to be talking about a single funding source, but rather the need for a strategy in all three of these jurisdictions to work with those governing bodies to move forward whatever the right solution is for Maryland, for DC, or for Virginia to help fund kind of the DMVMoves funding need. And so now with that kind of like background, these two guys chaired these advisory groups and went through, I think it was 27 total meetings. I think Jack had 14 and Bryan's group had 13. I just wanted to stop and say,
that's right, yeah.
Is there anything that you guys, what are your biggest takeaways that you want to kind of share with these folks who didn't necessarily go through that same experience as we move into this next phase of the process, which is really socializing the outcomes of DMVMoves and really starting to kind of advocate for the recommendations that came forward?
That's a great question, and thank you all for being here today. When I got this task from COG, I remember Randy Clark talking about Frankenstein and the funding models, and I'm like, what does this guy from Canada know about funding models? And Randy and I had a lot of conversations. DC does it one way, Maryland does it another way, Virginia does it another way. So this was a unique opportunity for us to all sit in a room together. I just want to make sure that everybody here knows that the initial ask by Randy was $1 billion. Not 900. I guess that feels better to say 900 than 1 billion. Coming from Fairfax County and talking with my CAOs in Fairfax, Loudoun, Tim Hemstreet in Loudoun, Mark Schwartz in Arlington, Jim Parajan, and believe it or not, the district, Kevin Donohue, we all sat together with Joe McAndrew trying to figure out how we can make something happen. We knew it wasn't going to be $1 million. Randy probably hoped it was going to be 800 million. That's not going to happen either. But we got to a place where it was 460 million. I have to tell you, those 13 meetings and absolutely detailing and eyeballing the numbers, I have to give the WMATA staff a lot of kudos for allowing us to get inside of their books to actually figure out what is state of good repair. And we're going to get there. The question is now for the political bodies to figure out how we're going to fund it. I think we have a good path in Virginia. I think DC's got a path. We're going to work with Maryland, but the key is getting it into a good state of repair. 460 million. Just for everybody to know, in Commonwealth Virginia, the localities are the ones that bond the financing. State really doesn't do that. So we are on the hook. Fairfax County, Alexandria, Arlington, Loudoun County now, we're all on the hook for pretty much all of the capital funding. We need to have that capital funding to ensure that we can continue to have a world-class system. And I think this DMV Moves process got us to that place.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, well, great, thanks. And Nick, thanks you and Bryan for the work that we've done collectively over the past 18 months, almost 2 years. And Kathy, thank you again for your partnership in putting this conversation on and continuing to have that conversation. And Clark and Randy, for your ongoing partnership and the efforts you're doing there. So it's sort of interesting. I think Clark probably understated a little bit the conversations, and I guess maybe that's why we needed an extra meeting. Some of our meetings went quite long because we did have disparate views at the table. If you think about the various interests that come together around transit, transportation, and mobility, I would say the one overriding takeaway is that there was really strong consensus around the need for a high-functioning, world-class public transit system. I think there was no ambiguity around that whatsoever. And so I thought that was extremely positive. And we did up front spend a lot of time thinking about what is the vision statement for this, and we came to the conclusion, again, business and community advocates and others, that, that a world-class transit system is the backbone of our economy. It touches everything that we do. And a lot of the other issues that we work on and the other things that we are trying to solve for, without an effective transportation and transit system, we can't even get to those, right? And so, as a region, we do have a responsibility to make sure that we get this right in doing that. I would also say, too, that there's a little bit of a discrepancy, I think, between maybe the public sector side and the business and advocacy side, because we don't really care as much about the jurisdictions as the jurisdictions do. No offense, Bryan.
Shocking.
Yes, shocking. What we want is an integrated system that works, right? And we want to figure out what the funding model is, and whether it's a little bit different in Montgomery County or Maryland, or whether in Virginia. That's not as relevant to us from our perspectives, though we know we need to get the funding to it, so we have to work through that. So I think one of the lessons learned here too, now that we have proposals in place to stabilize the system, and we can get into more detail around that, is that we really need to start thinking much more proactively about what comes next. How do we then take the baseline that we have here, the 2025 APTA award-winning transit agency, and how do we propel that into the future in a way that nobody else can come close to? And that's going to require this region to act, think, and behave very, very differently. And we need to start thinking about this as an integrated system, not separate parts, right? So that the sum of the parts is greater than the total. We need to start thinking differently about that. That's going to affect how we start to think about funding, as well as how we think about governance and management. We can't manage this system by 3 jurisdictional views. We have to manage this system through an agency view. And I would say that's probably one of the most important cultural aspects to this that we now are in a position to push forward. And so we actually did spend a lot of time in our group talking about those types of issues, because that's where the real potential of the value of this asset comes to the table. And until we can get to that, we're always just going to kind of be floating along.
Yeah.
No, thanks for that, Jack. And then, Jack, I actually want to come back to you, because Bryan and I talked about this, but you and I talked about this a lot longer, which is one of the kind of key takeaways from 2018, as people are thinking about this initiative and, what have we learned from that time? And I think you called it the Magna Carta. And, I'll just kind of give you a quick introduction. So for those of you who may not know, I was heavily involved in the 2018 funding package. And if I get 5 people in a room who I sat in the same room with 2018 and say, what did we expect to have happen from this? I get 6 answers. And some of you are like smiling, like, oh, that's cute. No, that's true. Like, it's actually what happens. Like, people, their recollections are different. People have different understanding about what was going to happen. And so, Jack, you really pushed for this concept that, again, you called the Magna Carta. Could you talk a little bit about that to this group so they can understand what we've done a little differently in this effort here?
So one of the things that we've done here is that we've documented everything that we've worked through here. So we have a shared set of assumptions that go into the modeling, that go into the projections that we have here, that go into the ask, and we're asking for the 3% increase indexed to inflation. But at least then we can come back in the circumstances like you described earlier, if we experience, and hopefully we don't, another COVID, or we hit 40% energy inflation or something like that. At least we understand what we agreed to in 2025, so that we can then say within the parameters of that agreement, this is what we can do. But then we can all agree that in order to be functional, we have to go outside of that. Mm-hmm. But we can all address what that means. And so having a very clear, documented set of assumptions right up front, this is what the $460 million will get us. This is what we expect over, as Randy was talking about, the long-term 20, 30, 40-year bonding period, so that we can at least manage to that. And then that allows the agency to actually manage their capital program in a way that we as a region have not been able to do to date.
Yep.
So that's, again, putting us a lot farther along. And we can get into some of the things that we hope to accomplish through that, and Randy touched on some of them. But that really is a differentiator, And none of this, one of the things, and I'll say this, and people have heard me say this too, is that sometimes, our region can get stuck chasing rainbows, But this puts us in a position where we can at least look for the rainbow. We needed to do this very hard work that we haven't done since the system was founded 60 years ago. Putting this in place then allows us to get to that next level. So this was really critical. So this, it's not sexy, it's not glamorous, there's not a lot of headlines here. But unless we did this, and so the guidance that we were getting from the task force was spot on, we had to get this done first. It was foundational.
Yeah, and I just want to, for all you advocates out there, really reinforce Jack's point as we have these discussions in the coming months with the elected officials and other decision makers. Baked into DMVMoves are new accountability provisions that will help us as a region hold this agency kind of accountable as they move forward with these new investments. But it also means that we'll have to recognize where there may be times where, as Jack said, in 2025, we all made an assumption that we thought was reasonable, and sometimes the world turns left when we think it's going to turn right. And in that case, it's not per se an issue where whoever's the general manager at that time has made a mistake. It's that the world happened differently. And as a region, we'll need to come back together and figure out what we want to do at that stage. And so I think it's a really important thing that Jack was hitting on. Bryan, as we've talked about kind of what happens now that the boards have endorsed the DMVMoves recommendations, I think a lot of folks are expecting Virginia to potentially be the first place where this discussion happens. But I think Virginia actually has a slightly bigger problem to solve than DC and Maryland there. And so could you talk a little bit about kind of the operating funding needs that Virginia has in addition to these capital needs, where Maryland and DC have funded theirs long term, but in Virginia that still hasn't been solved?
Thanks for that question. Why are we all here, right? Yeah. The start from my process actually after, and having Jack as a co-chair was great. We worked seamlessly together. Unfortunately, he couldn't get it done in 12 meetings. But
14 was pretty good.
Yeah, but all jokes aside, as soon as I'm done here, I'm going to my board to give a presentation on DMVMoves with Clark Mercer. We're going to try and get a resolution built in Fairfax. I believe Clark is also going to be at Loudoun County this afternoon to get that squared away, and then Arlington and Alexandria. And we have to really just cobble it all together. So when all the localities are all in line with at least the understanding that there's going to be an additional outlay of cash, I believe the date is December 16th. I have a legislative meeting. 17th?
Yes.
Okay. I will be meeting with our delegates and our senators and hopefully our governor-elect to pitch the plan. We have various funding sources in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Obviously, Fairfax is one, as well as all the localities, but there's DRPT, there's MVTA, MVTC. We have to get all those sources together. We have a companion group called SJ28. They're working on a funding mechanism for WMATA. If that happens, my life is a lot easier during the budget process, to be quite frank. I'm hopeful that our legislative team and delegation can support the initiative of the $460 million as opposed to Fairfax County and Arlington and Alexandria and Loudoun coming up with those funds. We've had good dialogue and good discussion. However, we're not there yet. I mean, the key is that we are continuing the dialogue and the discussion. I'm also speaking with our DC Representative Kevin Donohue, the city administrator there, as well as Joe McAndrew over in Maryland. We have to come forward together. But when you talk about the future of Metro and WMATA, you also have to think about the future of our region. We're looking at VRE, we're looking at MARC, we're looking at Longbridge. It's about a path of taking our region and bringing it and elevating it to the next level. Our tourism is key, our economic development is key, but key is being able to provide a service that is absolutely better than any place in the world. We look at London, England, we look at Japan, we look at Canada, unfortunately, TTC. However, we need to be the best. And if we can't be the best, we need not to try to say we're going to try to be the best. We must be the best as we move forward. So that's where we are. Hopefully today I can put one step forward, at least in Fairfax County, put a marker. My budget is going to be released on February 17th. I'll say this to Randy, my goal is to have WMATA funding inside of that budget. That's it, commensurate with the $460 million or less, depending on what we do. Hold on. Depending on what happens with our state outcome, with the Commonwealth's outcome.
No, that's very fair. And Bryan, you got to this earlier about how, like in Virginia, the funding model is different, and the burden, absent state action, falls to those local governments. And so, another thing that in Virginia we're hoping folks will address and solve this upcoming session is the region collectively came together and put additional operating funding into WMATA over the last several years. Virginia did that through one-time general fund surpluses. For any of you who've been reading the Post recently, you may be seeing that the budget situation isn't looking like it's a world of continued surpluses in Virginia. And so I know Bryan and his board is all hopeful that the Assembly will work with them to find a way to make sure that doesn't fall just on the backs of those local property taxes in the jurisdictions in Northern Virginia. Jack, we had a lot of discussions in your group, as you, I think, politely said, disparate viewpoints at times on issues. And so, in the DMVMoves recommendations is both funding to really ensure the state of good repair of the system and make sure we don't fall back to where we were before the funding from 2018, but also money to modernize the Metro Rail system to make it faster, more reliable, more efficient from an operating kind of standpoint. At times in our meetings, we had folks kind of saying, well, is this the time, based on all the headwinds the region is facing, to make these types of investments? And I think we had that discussion a lot there. And so could you talk with these folks about kind of some of the things you said when we were having those discussions in the advisory group about, with the headwinds, whether it's the time to make those investments?
Well, I would say there's always headwinds, so it doesn't really matter, right? So, today, tomorrow, the next day, there's going to be something. There's going to be some reason. So you got to make the investments now. Tomorrow it's more expensive, right? So every day we wait, it costs us more and more and more. So we need to start making those investments. And particularly important, as Randy pointed out too, the signaling system is outdated, plain and simple. There's no other way to explain that. A lot of the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers that built the component parts for that, are no longer in business, and so WMATA does an amazing job at holding that together. They maintain all of the safety requirements that are necessary, but it prevents us from doing things that are necessary to really ensure that we're getting the value out of our assets. I'll say with you, you spend a lot of money on an Apple Watch, for those of you that do, but I guarantee you I'm only getting about 25% of the value out of it, right? And so and maybe with a watch that makes sense, but on a transit system, that doesn't make any sense. We have to maximize the value of those assets. Yeah. So we need this capital investment now to upgrade the signaling system. Give you an example right now. We talk a lot about the bottleneck between Stadium Armory and Roslyn. So you have 3 lines going through there. You have blue, orange, and silver lines going through there. So you can put, 27 trains an hour through that tunnel? So that's a bottleneck. If we can move to automated train operations, we can up that to potentially 32 trains or so an hour, increasing our throughput by about 30%. That potentially avoids the need for another tunnel under DC. Not that we couldn't even get the funding for that, which we likely couldn't at 30, 40, or $50 billion. You could never get the environmental impact assessments done to do that. So that holds us back as a region. So we need to think very differently about how do we use our assets. And when you think about it, $460 million a year between 3 jurisdictions to make the kind of investments that we're talking about here, it's really a no-brainer. And so how do we put that forward? So that's just a first entry point to getting us to where the system operates at much more of a world-class level, alleviates a lot of the issues and problems that we're experiencing right now, allows the agency to continue to grow ridership so that we can come off that list that Ellen mentioned earlier, which is not one of the lists that we want to be on as a congested region, so that we can get more people on transit. So I do think that, this is the time to be thinking about that. And so that's, from an operating perspective, but then also as a region, how do we start thinking about this as an economic growth engine and not mini fiefdoms within the region? And so we need to start thinking much more holistically about how do we build out our transit, transportation, and mobility systems across the region. And so that to me is where the real opportunity is. Let's get through this. The other thing I would say too is that we're looking to start this program in 2028. So we do have, so we've got to get things on the books now, but we have time to fine tune this a little bit. We have time to figure out how to fund some of these things, and we are not asking for, sort of end of the world kinds of funding mechanisms here. This is pretty reasonable in a region that is blessed with resources that are the envy of the country. So we really do need to push on this. And I would say, and I know Kathy and I have talked about this and others in our networks too, is that the business community needs to push harder, and we will push harder, and we need to give more cover to the jurisdictions that our expectations are for an integrated world-class system, irregardless of some of the dysfunctionality or regional fragmentation that we have through the jurisdictions. Sorry, I don't.
No. Thank you, Jack. And I got this signal from the back of the room that we need to kind of wrap up, but because they gave me the microphone, and I don't think they can turn it off. I'm going to talk for a little bit longer. As advocates, I just want you all to think about a few things as you move forward. You had a bunch of technical folks dig through all this stuff for 18 months. We asked questions. So I don't see Tom Webster, so he might be here, and a number of other WMATA staff, to the point where I think they wanted to pull their hair out. They didn't get all of it. He still has some hair. But we know what will happen if the region doesn't come together and work to try and solve this problem. We are going to quickly, and quickly is obviously a relative term, but in the next 10 or so years, we will be back with the condition of this system to where we were before 2018. I rode the system then, and I ride it now. And I think we all know it's in a much, much better place and is delivering more value to this region. And so how do we maintain that, those benefits? And as Jack talked about with these headwinds, how do we make these investments in Metro to make this region more competitive as we look at facing some of these headwinds that we're looking at? So the modernization investments that are included in DMVMoves are really, really important. One of the other things that the general manager hinted at, and I just want to make kind of the concluding point here, though, is the WMATA team has also brought some stuff to the table that we haven't seen from them in the past. And that's baked into these capital program are a host of investments that will drive down the operating cost long term and make this system more efficient. This was something we asked for back in 2016 and 2015, and we got some kind of examples here. This time, though, it is core to the capital program and the recommendations that we have worked with WMATA to develop through this DMVMoves initiative. So as a region, we need to do this to ensure we have a state of good repair, to ensure that we can remain competitive, and that long term we have opportunity to drive some of those operating cost curves down. So again, thank you for coming today and listening to this panel. And Kathy, I think I'm supposed to invite you back up. So thank you, Jack, and thank you, Bryan.
Thanks, everybody.